I want to say hello to people who may be watching this online or may want to watch it in recording afterwards. We're in St. John's Presbyterian Church in Toronto on Broadview Avenue, and this is a series of ecumenical events designed to celebrate the Nicene Creed, which is 1,700 years old this year. It's a festival of faith that the Canadian Council of Churches Worship Committee is sponsoring. We're doing one event a month, and my good friend, long-time friend, not quite 50 years, but darn close, the Reverend Dr. Lawrence DeWolf is going to be talking to us about the Nicene Creed. And Lawrence is a congregational minister, as well as a classmate of mine, and his wife was a classmate. Janet Allen DeWolf was a classmate of mine, and also a professor of theology at the Atlantic School of Theology. So it is Sunday, June the 1st. It's a little unfortunate today. All roads are closed, so we have a pretty low attendance here in person, but hopefully we'll overcome that, and people may want to watch this online afterwards. So anything else I can say about Lawrence? We've been friends for a long, long time. And I'm really, really grateful for him coming out here today to talk with us. So I'm going to sit down, and if there's any questions or answers, I'll join in.
Thank you, Maureen, and thank you for the invitation and the trust. And I was surprised, but also happy to have the invitation and to be able to answer it. And maybe I should preface it a little bit, because by and large, in our tradition, in the Reformed tradition generally, and in the Presbyterian Church in particular, we're not familiar with the Nicene Creed. Really, we aren't. We may have leafed through our hymn books and discovered, oh, there's a longer one. I thought the Apostles' Creed was the only one. And maybe we don't even say the Apostles' Creed very often anymore. But the flip side of that is, in some congregations, there's a copy of Living Faith, the green booklet in the pews, and people read from that. So professing our faith is very much a part of our tradition. But the history of the Nicene Creed, it goes back 1,700 years since the Council of Nicaea was convened. And its purpose was really, after the Emperor Constantine made Christianity first legal and then the religion of the Roman Empire, he believed that there should be a unifying statement of faith, because up until that time, the church throughout the Roman Empire, throughout the world, was very local. And it was a collection of congregations or regions with many congregations, led by bishops, some of whom had charge of one church and some of whom had charge of many. But there was a lot of variety of belief in those days before fast communication that we have today. And so to get everyone together, or everyone they could get together, in hopes that they would agree on something that they could then take home with them, was very important to the Emperor Constantine. It became very important to the leaders of the church, especially in Rome. So that's the background. But yes, it is longer than the Apostles' Creed, which is actually newer and has nothing to do with the Apostles. Almost the Apostles' Creed, which we might know, is kind of a summary of the Nicene Creed. But the Nicene Creed is used regularly in worship in many Christian traditions. It's in some of the orders of service for our church that are provided for us if we choose to use them. But it's, as I've said, not so familiar to us. Ecumenically, however, I was just thinking about this morning. I was born in Nova Scotia, grew up during the period when the ecumenical movement was just spreading like wildfire in North America. And in many ways, my home community in Nova Scotia was at the vanguard. I mean, the local clergy and congregations in Pictou County, Nova Scotia, the center of Presbyterianism in Eastern Canada, jumped on it like it was the wagon they wanted to ride together. And so I grew up in an atmosphere in which we worshiped together, Catholic and Protestant. We shared many things together. There were pioneering interchurch councils. And so I grew up understanding that to be Presbyterian, this is what our minister said, to be Presbyterian means to be ecumenical. And then later on in my life, when I went to teach part-time and full-time, I was teaching at an ecumenical school of theology in Halifax. And it was a product of that first wave of ecumenism in the 1970s. And it was unique in the world at that time because the Roman Catholic Church was a full partner with the other churches, which is not something that has been the case in other places. So it was a unique situation to be teaching in, and I taught, in my 15 years of teaching, I think I taught 3 Presbyterians. But the rest were United Church, Anglican, Roman Catholic, Unitarian. We had one Buddhist. It was truly ecumenical, and it was becoming interfaith by the time I moved on from there. So I feel a kinship for events like this, and also familiar from years of ecumenical worship with the Nicene Creed, maybe a little more familiar than most Presbyterians. And so Maureen told me that I could, if I chose, talk about a Presbyterian or Reformed perspective on the Creed. What does it mean? What does confessing the faith mean to us? And then I noticed when the event was publicized that there was a theme for the day, which I'll touch on at the end of my remarks. I had hoped to have enough ability with the technology to be able to play you 2 short pieces of music before we start. Unfortunately, I have to do the worst thing possible, and is that tell you about music. But I want to begin with some music that was very important to someone who is very important to this world of ours, and that is the late Pope Francis. Now, Pope Francis loved the music of Mozart. I love the music of Mozart. And one of the things that I've always noted about Mozart are the masses he wrote, the music he wrote for the church. And I came across this quote not long after Pope Francis died that I thought, yeah, I better go back and listen to this one in particular. Now, when a composer was asked to compose a mass, it basically meant sending all of the texts, including the Creed, from the Roman Catholic Mass to music for choirs and soloists. And today, these masses are performed in concert halls. Very rarely will they be performed in a church because they require a huge choir and a symphony orchestra. So they're very much concert pieces. But one of the things I noticed was that because Mozart loved opera, and he was, as a good Austrian, a Roman Catholic, he had to make his living, so he took a lot of commissions from the church, and he wrote masses. And my feeling has always been that when he had to sit down to do this, he would rather have written an opera, so that's what he did. He set the text of the Mass, it wrote them as if they were an opera. And one of the things that I notice is that when they come to the Creed, first word in Latin, credo, I believe, we believe, or just believe, the choir just explodes. And then different parts of the creed go to different singers. Here's what Pope Francis said. Among musicians, I love Mozart. The et incarnatus est. He was incarnate. From his Mass in C minor is matchless. It lifts you to God. I love Mozart. Mozart fulfills me, but I cannot think about his music. I have to listen to it. I cannot think about his music. I have to listen to it. And Francis goes on to speak of J.S. Bach, especially Bach's St. Matthew Passion. And he loves Bach, he loves Beethoven, but Mozart for him was the one who lifted him. Especially this one piece, this soprano aria that soars like an operatic aria. And as a Presbyterian, of course, I have to find a Reformed angle. And I realized that there was another great lover of Mozart, and that was the theologian Karl Barth. Karl Barth was probably Mozart's greatest German fan through all the 20th century. Barth listened to Mozart every day. He listened to Mozart before he began to think about writing and teaching. He said, in heaven, when the angels sing to God, they sing Bach. But when they just get together in a circle and sing for the sake of singing, they sing Mozart. So he loved Mozart. And reading what he said about Mozart for the same reasons that Pope Francis did. And to paraphrase Barth, because as Maureen will know, Barth's sentences were longer than marathons in German, but also in English translation. And so I was trying to read one passage he wrote about Mozart, and I got lost in about the sixth subordinate clause of the sentence. So I'll paraphrase. He said, Bach has a doctrine. He demands that we think. Mozart, now this is my paraphrase, has a heart and even a soul. And so I think Barth might have agreed with Francis. Mozart fulfills me, but I cannot think about his music. I have to listen to it. So that opening statement of the Creed, Credo, is both triumphant and defiant. I've heard it many times, I've sung it a few. And in the C minor Mass, Mozart gives that, the song about the incarnation of Christ to a soprano, an operatic soprano, and it soars and falls and soars again. Just one last word from Karl Barth. If I ever get to heaven, I would first of all seek out Mozart, and only then inquire after Augustine, St. Thomas, Luther, Calvin, and Schleiermacher. Pope Francis might agree. Or the way that Thomas Merton, another ecumenical friend, Roman Catholic monk, said that he expected to meet Barth in heaven, each one of them pushing a wheelbarrow full of the books they've written, but ultimately they'll just drop the wheelbarrows and go and find Mozart. So, why have I taken this amount of time to talk about Mozart and his music? Well, it leads to the first thing, the first thing that I would like to say. And it's not uniquely Reformed or Presbyterian, but it's something that I fear we have forgotten. In our church that we say is the Reformed church that is always reforming, I say it's the confessing church that is always confessing. And credo in the Mozart Mass or any setting isn't the opening salvo of a barrage of doctrine, as if it begins the creed, which is then a list of things, a point list of things you have to tick off and say you believe. It's not the opening salvo of a barrage of doctrine, it is doxology. Because to profess faith is to praise. To declare credo, I believe. To speak or shout or sing the Nicene Creed, or any church's statement of belief. To do that is to worship. And the word for what we say means the sound theology or the right theology of the church, orthodoxy, actually means right glory, proper praise, and worthy worship. Now, few congregations in our Presbyterian Church in Canada say a creed every Sunday. I had one where I served for a number of years that said it every Sunday while I was holding the basin with all the offering plates in it. They professed their faith, the faith in which they gave their money, and I struggled with that, but finally made peace with it. But they said the creed every Sunday. But those of us who do say a creed, when we do, we say the Apostles' Creed, because the Nicene Creed is too long for most Presbyterians, and is too complicated for most Presbyterian ministers who are trained to believe that we have to explain everything, or at least to try. Now, John Calvin, the founder of our Reformed faith that we claim, he ordered that the Apostles' Creed be sung at every communion service. Sung. And if he'd got his way, there would be communion every Sunday. So that would have been every Sunday, sing the creed. In fact, he took the French version of it and set it to meter so that it could be put to music himself. He understood that music carries meaning into minds and hearts more powerfully than any other medium. That's why he exerted such strict control over music in the church. But he also knew that what is sung is more easily remembered than what is recited. And one key to understanding the place of those ancient creeds in the Reformed tradition is to remember that in our history, the very act of gathering to worship and hear God's word was, for the Reformers, a defiant declaration of faith, a loud credo. And I've often said to congregations in today's context, when so relatively few of us go to church and so many around us know nothing of the church, for us still to gather every Sunday is a profound and even defiant declaration, we believe. But it's also an offering of praise to God. And another key is the fact that we in the Reformed tradition have always been a confessing church. The ancient creeds of the church are foundational. They're foundational to confessions of faith that we believe each generation must offer in its own time and circumstances. And this is foundational to the resistance to Nazism that was embodied in the very famous confessing church in Germany in the 1930s. Those Christians who would not capitulate and become part of Hitler's national church drafted some very, very famous declarations of their faith. And they stood on these, and some shed their blood because of it. And that goes back to Karl Barth. So these are some words that Maureen may be able to recite from memory as I share them with you. Well, these are the words that my Presbyterian colleagues and I have agreed to. In my case, I was trying to add them up, and with licensing, ordination, recognitions, and inductions, not counting the times when I had to read them as a moderator, I think I signed off on them 9 times in the course of my ministry. And that included my installation to teach at the school. We acknowledge our historic continuity with the Holy Catholic Church and our doctrinal heritage in the ecumenical creeds, including the Nicene Creed and the confessions of the Reformation. Our subordinate standards are the Westminster Confession of Faith, the Declaration of Faith Concerning Church and Nation of 1954, which incidentally, excuse me, though it was written in 1954, not long after the Second World War, has some things to say about what it means to say Jesus is Lord that are really, really important for us to remember today in our time of Christian nationalism and Christian imperialism and what's going on not just south of the border in many churches. Look it up. And then we have Living Faith, the little green book that was adopted in 1998, but written in the 80s. But here's the key. And such doctrine as the church may yet confess in the church's continuing function of reformulating the faith. And such doctrine as the church may yet confess, because the church's continuing function is reformulating the faith. Excuse me. Which is to say that even though, excuse me, even though we recognize and honor a creed that was first drafted 1700 years ago, we insist in our tradition that the book is not closed. That though the ink is dry on the page, there are new pages to be written with fresh ink as we work out what it means to confess our faith in our time and in our place. Because our continuing function, we believe, and that includes every minister and elder who said yes to these words, is participating in working out what it means to confess our faith as Christians today. Now, in 1947, Canadian theologian Walter Bryden gave an address to the Presbyterian General Assembly. He was an interesting man. In 1925, he became the professor of everything at Knox College. And then he taught there, he was principal, he died far too young. And he has my heart because he was also a very rabid baseball fan. He was a fan of the original Toronto Maple Leafs professional baseball team. So he would have seen Jackie Robinson play for the Maple Leafs before he left. Famously, once some students actually managed to persuade him to take them to a game. And they thought then, well, Principal Bryden, we have questions for you. And he looked at them and said, did you come here to watch baseball or talk theology? And they didn't say a word after that. Anyway, Walter Bryden gave an address to the General Assembly, which met like the one that's starting to meet this evening, first week of June every year. But it was the 300th anniversary of the Westminster Confession of Faith. Now, some people say the Westminster Confession of Faith, which was written in 1647, is too old for Presbyterians today to pay attention to. 300 years, 370-odd years now. We're talking about a creed that was started 1,700 years ago. So he marked the 300th anniversary with a lecture on the significance of the Westminster Confession. And that address, I got to admit, is foundational to my thoughts today. He honored the tradition of the confessing church that is always confessing. He upheld the place of the Westminster Confession in Presbyterian churches all around the world. but he dared to say that any confession of faith is out of date the moment it is adopted by any council of the church and enshrined among a church's official documents. A confession of faith, a creed, is a product of a time and place, a set of circumstances, and the concerns of the men, yes, men, until very recently, men who composed it. It is honored when those who know it carry it forward to their times and places and into their circumstances and concerns. So it's honored when those who know it carry it forward to their times and places, into their circumstances and concerns. So past creeds are foundational to present and future creeds. And they will be repeated in ways born of each succeeding generation, honored as living documents. Now, the words matter. The words matter. Whether the words are drafted in the year 325 or 1647 or 1954 or 1998, the words matter. But it's the act of confessing the faith. It's the act of confessing that makes the church, as we believe it in our tradition. So for this Presbyterian, celebrating the 1700th anniversary of the Council of Nicaea is more about what they did than what they said. And notice I can't say what they agreed to, because there is still disagreement throughout the church around the world over a few words in the Nicene Creed. It's called the Filioque. I'm sure it'll come up in another session of this series. But to say or shout, or best, to sing, credo, we believe, and to gather and repeat any confession of faith is doxology, praise. It's worship. It's a declaration of the church's identity, and at times, it's an act of defiance against gathering darkness and cruel circumstances. And just as a little sidelight, back to Karl Barth writing on Mozart, one of the things that Mozart saw in Barth saw in Mozart's music was that he believed that for the whole period of Mozart's life, the big question that was tormenting Europe and all the Western world was the justice of God when so many people died in the great earthquake in Lisbon of, I think it was about 1747, something like that. 90,000 people died. And Barth saw in Mozart's music the answer or the response that theological minds couldn't offer to those questions. For him, in that darkness and with those unanswerable questions, for Mozart to write soaring music for the church or the opera hall was his answer, that in the midst of this darkness which we do not deny, this is who we are, and these are the sounds we make into that darkness. So again, for us to say in 2025, when we are so painfully aware that we are so few in almost any church you may think of, for us even to gather together, even to make a sound, is to confess our faith. It's that act of worship. So I mentioned that I served on the faculty of Atlantic School of Theology in Halifax, a pioneering ecumenical seminary. So my area of teaching was pastoral or practical theology, and one of my main teaching tasks was to teach preaching, subject of homiletics. And In my teaching, I relied on the work of another Jesuit priest. Pope Francis, I'm sure, would have read his writing, a man by the name of Walter Ong, and what he taught about what he called orality. And preaching, obviously, is an act of oral communication. The preacher stands up and speaks. Whatever preparation they've done, whatever consultation or whatever has happened beforehand, the preacher offers something and it's spoken. That's an act of oral communication. Well, so is saying the creed, or shouting it, or singing it. So the Nicene Creed was born in an era where the main culture was what he called primary orality. I mean, that's simply, virtually no one could read, and almost all communication was oral. So what was to be known, to be remembered, was heard, also experienced in relationship with the one speaking it, and it was repeated over and over again, which is very different from our culture, which is primarily literate. If it's important, it's going to be written down, and we will read it, and while we're looking at it, somebody who's also looking at it will explain it to us. That's a primary literate culture. But the people who first received the Nicene Creed in the 4th century could only hear it. So it was given to them for them to hear, to learn, to repeat, not to read and memorize and recite. In the field of storytelling, excuse me, we talk about learning something through the eyes or through the ears. Which are we more likely to digest and remember and carry forward? What we learn with our ears or with our eyes. So even when the Nicene Creed was written down, it was written down so it could be carried forward, so it could be spoken. A profession of faith is an act of oral communication. Another thing that I take from my field of homiletics is from a homiletician called Eugene Lowry. When he talks about the sermon is not an object in space, it is an event in time. And think of the ways we often use what's called spatial language when we speak of a homily or a sermon, and likewise the creed. We talk about constructing an object that we then represent in speech. We talk about the church councils, like the Council of Nicaea, cobbling together their reports and statements. A lot of that will happen this week at General Assembly. We say the creed represents, we don't use this term as often today as we did, but we say it represents the deposit of faith, like it's something that's been given to us in our hands. And too often people describe our preaching and our professions of faith as collections of objects. Words, 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 and often said to be dead words. Things that just fall there. But insofar as the Nicene Creed is common among Christians, it's safe to say that at least on the Lord's Day, the Creed exists as an event in the speech and song of the faithful all around the world. And it may seem to die with the last reverberation of speech or music, but in the weekly silences, the people who have said the creed, or sung the creed, or shouted the creed, live the faith. So the event continues to be announced again in each and every gathering and celebration. So as an event in orality, the creed, spoken, shouted, or sung, both creates and expresses meaning, but that meaning differs from location to location, context to context, Christian to Christian. Each of us hears, experiences, and repeats and believes the creed in her or his own way. And that may be completely different next Sunday. I turn again to homiletics. I taught that the event of the sermon begins with and within the preacher, although it really doesn't start there. It's everything that came before the preacher, but still, we can say a sermon or my talk today as an event begins with and within the preacher, but it continues and grows within those who hear it and experience it. And really, I can do my best, but I have no control over where it goes in you from what I offer. Because the meaning and purpose of the words are worked out in the lives of the faithful people with the help of the Holy Spirit. And so it is with each speaking or shouting or singing of any confession of the church's faith. And we might say the event we commemorate today began when the Council of Nicaea convened, continues and grows today and every day, and is renewed with each new creed or confession, and must be announced again and again and again. Et incarnatus est, who was incarnate of the Holy Spirit and the Virgin Mary, and became human, and he was crucified for us under Pontius Pilate, and suffered and was buried. And the third day he rose again, according to the Scriptures, and ascended into heaven. So at the heart of the creed, there is a mystery that can only be expressed by repeating, rehearsing an event, telling a story. So my final point is that the Council of Nicaea in itself was what I'll call a bounded event. It did have a beginning and it did have an end, although it went on for years. But it's something that we can look back on, we can read the histories of, we can describe. It's a story we can tell. And that includes amusing anecdotes, the stuff of legends. Now we know this probably isn't true. So Bishop Nicholas of Myra probably didn't cross the floor of the synod and punch a man named Arius in the face, but it's a good story, especially when we realize who did Bishop Nicholas of Myra turn out to be for us? Santa Claus. And in fact, one of the reasons he was called St. Nicholas is that supposedly after he punched Arius in the face, now Arius was one who didn't believe that Jesus was fully divine, putting it simply. Because he was punched Arius in the face, the other bishops took him and threw him in jail, and they stripped him of his bishop's robes. But in the morning, when they went to give him breakfast, he had those robes back on. It was a miracle. So that's one of the reasons that St. Nicholas is called St. Nicholas. Didn't happen. Not a chance. But that's the kind of story that's associated with the Synod of Nicaea as that kind of event. But when we say or shout or sing the creed, we tell the story. Incarnate of the Holy Spirit and the Virgin Mary, became human, crucified, suffered, was buried, rose again, and ascended. We tell that story. And we can strip away all the words that frame these words, and we may still disagree over parts of that frame of words around the story that's at the heart of the creed. But the story remains. And Christians differ over which part of that story we begin with, Sunday after Sunday. In some traditions, every Sunday service is a rehearsal. And I mean rehearsal not in practice, but the sense of it's being presented again. The rehearsal of the suffering and dying is central to their shared worship life. We, in our Reformed tradition, always begin with the rising and ascending. We don't deny the cross. We don't deny the death of our Lord and Savior. But our starting point is always with the resurrection and ascension. And it simply means that, as one ecumenist famously said, I can't remember who, we look at different facets of the same jewel first. The story, the whole story, is the same. Now, what unites us is that mystery of salvation, the narrative at the heart of the creed. So may we fight the temptation to squeeze the story out of the creed and reduce it to a barrage of doctrine. To paraphrase Francis, I cannot think about this mystery at the heart of the creed. I can only listen to its telling and tell it again and again. So that concludes my musings, my ramblings through the Creed and Reformed history. But thank you for your attention, those who are here. Thank you for your attention, those who are watching.
Lawrence, thank you so much. I'm really hopeful that people are going to be watching this recording of this. It'll certainly go out ecumenically to many, many congregations and churches in Toronto.
Thank you.
And I found that a lot of fun and really appreciated it, and thank you so much. I'd never heard the fist fight story before. My father was a minister,
Yeah.
and I remember in my childhood he came home one evening and said, "A fist fight broke out on the floor of presbytery tonight."
Yes.
Never said
Yes.
why or
Yes.
what. But rather than celebrate it and create a creed around it, declare it a miracle, they made their best efforts to never mention it again.
Yeah.
Anyway, I'm so appreciative. Thank you so much. And for anybody online, this Festival of Faith, these once-a-month events, will continue for the rest of the year, and we will send out notices as they come up. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And I think we can... Oh, and the other thing is, for my congregation, one of these Sundays we're going to use the Nicene Creed. I've never used it in worship, but we're going to do it. So I look forward to that, too.
Just use it. Forget the Athanasian Creed. We just don't... Nobody observes that. It used to be in the Anglican prayer book, but...
I'll make sure I've got the right one. I'll send you an email.
It's like every second sentence is "damn you if you don't believe in the Trinity." So that's the Athanasian Creed.
Okay,
basically.
if it says that, I won't put
that.
Sorry,
use
pardon
that.
me.
But Nicholas was an interesting character because there were many legends, miraculous legends about him that lasted, but his acts of charity toward the poor were also thought of as a reason for him being made a saint. But some of those stories had miraculous elements added to them. But it began with his violent defense of the divinity of Christ and the Trinity, you know, against Arius, who some historians are now saying wasn't such a bad guy after all.
That's really cool. I mean, at the very least, it says people got really emotionally involved in their faith. Like, it meant a lot to them.
It was, until Christianity was made legal and then official in the Roman Empire, it was a matter of life and death. And some historians would say that's one reason why the Emperor Constantine wanted to make the bishops come up with a creed, was to make peace among them, so that he didn't have to put up with the regional infighting, because he wanted control over the whole empire, which was huge then. And so it was an attempt to make peace. But if it's true about Nicholas and Arius, the warring continued.
I knew very little about the Nicene Creed. The last time I was in a group where we talked about it was years ago. So thank you so much.
Oh,
that was
you're
great.
welcome.
And the tie-in. I'm so sorry we didn't ask Grace to play a piece of Mozart on our organ. We'll maybe get her to do that some Sunday also.
You know, during COVID times, like so many ministers, I became an expert at downloading and editing and combining and getting music. I even had my little Bluetooth speaker ready to bring in. And I just, in the end, I couldn't do it. And to tell you the truth, it was more important for me to have a week visiting my sister in PEI than it was chasing around Toronto trying to find an engineer to do it for me. So I just let it go. But yeah, anything. Bart learned about Mozart because his father played the magic flute over and over again in their home. And so he wrote more about the operas than the masses. But you know, I believe you listen to a Mozart mass, and it's an opera in miniature. And Bart said, no, Mozart probably wasn't a conventional Roman Catholic, but to make a living, he worked for the church. And so he infused the church's music with a spirit that other people couldn't. Karl Barth said that.
Not what I think of Karl Barth.
No. One of my late colleagues who taught at AST for many years, Martin Rumscheit, I had him come back one summer to teach a course on Barth, and he started every class by playing Mozart. And so his class was more about the biography and history of the theologian than his admittedly confusing and frustrating theological musings. But yeah, but I love the image that Thomas Merton, the great mystic monk, who also loved Mozart and respected Barth, and they were almost exactly contemporary in their lives. He said, yeah, I expect when Karl Barth and I get to heaven, we will both have a wheelbarrow full of all the books we've written, but they won't count for a thing. We're just going to let them go and go see Mozart first. Anyway.
So we're going to ask Grace to play some Mozart at some Sunday for us this year. Thank you so much. Thank you to everybody online. We'll be posting it and sending it around to people afterwards. So I think we can wave goodbye and turn off the video. And Julie has been making some coffee for us out there if we want some.